AI scanned every crop circle on Earth. What it uncovered left everyone speechless. There is a field in southern England where, some mornings, farmers walk out at dawn and find something that was not there the night before. No footprints leading in. No footprints leading out. Just a shape, enormous and precise, pressed into the wheat as if an invisible hand had reached down while the world was asleep. For nearly 50 years, these shapes have kept appearing, and for nearly 50 years, we have argued about what they mean. Today, that argument gets a new player because researchers have finally done something nobody had done before. They gathered thousands of crop circle photographs spanning 5 decades, fed them into a modern image recognition system, and asked it a simple question. Is there a pattern here, or have we all been staring at nothing? What came back did not settle the argument. It reopened it. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to where it all began. Not in a laboratory, but in the chalky, ancient farmland of Wiltshire, England, a place that has been sacred to mystery long before crop circles existed. This is the land of Stonehenge, of Avebury stone rings, of burial mounds that predate the pyramids. So when strange circular shapes started showing up in the fields here in the late 1970s, there was an eerie sense that the landscape was simply doing what it had always done, drawing attention to itself with something round, deliberate, and unexplained. The earliest formations were almost comically simple. A single flattened circle in a field of wheat or barley, the stalks swirled neatly in one direction, dew still resting on them at sunrise. Farmers assumed it was weather, a freak downdraft, a whirlwind spinning out of a storm cloud. Others blamed rutting deer or birds performing some strange, mating display. A meteorologist named Terence Meaden even proposed a scientific theory in the early 1980s, suggesting that spinning columns of air, something like miniature stationary tornadoes he called plasma vortices, could form over the specific chalk hills of Wiltshire and press circular patterns into crops. For a while, this theory had real traction, since it offered a natural explanation for a natural-looking shape. Nobody thought much of it beyond that. It was a story for the pub, not for the history books. But the circles didn't stay simple, and that is the detail that eventually made scientists, skeptics, and casual observers alike sit up and pay attention. Through the early 1980s, single circles began multiplying into clusters, a large ring with smaller circles orbiting it, spaced with a precision that was hard to attribute to chance, and certainly hard to attribute to a spinning column of wind, which would have no reason to produce evenly spaced satellite circles around a central one. By the mid-1980s, those circles were connected by narrow avenues of flattened crop, forming shapes that resembled keys, dumbbells, and symbols with no obvious cultural reference point. The edges of these formations were startlingly clean. Stand at the boundary, and you could have 1 foot on standing wheat and 1 foot on wheat bent flat, with almost no ragged transition between the two. There was no torn crop, no random crushing. There was a line, and on either side of that line, the wheat behaved completely differently. Photographers began renting small aircraft, because it became obvious these designs weren't meant to be appreciated from the ground. Standing at the edge of a field, all you saw was a confusing sprawl of bent stalks. But from 200 feet up, that sprawl resolved into something composed, centered, balanced, clearly built for an eye looking straight down. That single observation troubled investigators for years. Whoever, or whatever, was creating these patterns seemed to be designing them for an aerial vantage point that no one standing in a dark field at night could have possessed. By 1990, the phenomenon had exploded in both frequency and complexity. Formations went from a handful of connected rings to sprawling compositions with more than a dozen distinct elements, nested shapes, nearly mathematical symmetry stretching across an entire field with no visible drift or error. Circles turned into pictograms. Pictograms turned into fractal-like patterns that echoed themselves at shrinking scales, the way a fern or a coastline does. Some formations even seem to encode the golden ratio in their proportions, a number that shows up again and again in nature, from seashells to galaxies, and one that is notoriously difficult to draw by eye in the dark, at speed, without instruments. This is where the story usually splits into 2 camps shouting past each other. One camp insists this is unmistakably extraterrestrial or otherwise supernatural in origin, landing marks, messages, warnings. The other insists it is entirely human, an elaborate and stubbornly maintained prank. Both camps, for decades, argued about intent while barely discussing the geometry itself. And that's the gap researchers wanted modern pattern recognition tools to fill. Not who did this, but simply what, mathematically, is actually happening in these shapes over time. The honest, well-documented answer arrived in 1991, and it's a part of the story that often gets left out of the more sensational retellings. Two English pranksters, Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, publicly confessed to having created many of the Wiltshire formations using nothing more than wooden planks, rope, and a length of wire attached to a cap for sighting straight lines. They had started in 1978, the same period the earliest simple circles appeared, inspired, they said, by tales of UFOs and a desire to see if they could convince people that aliens had landed. Over more than a decade, they refined their technique, and as their confidence and skill grew, so did the complexity of what they made. They even demonstrated their method for journalists, stamping out a complex formation in a single night to prove it could be done, and the tabloid press covered their confession with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Their confession didn't end the phenomenon, it multiplied it. Once the technique was public, other groups of circle makers, some organized into semi-professional crop circle art collectives, such as the well-known group associated with the website Circle Makers, began competing to outdo one another, using surveying tools, GPS devices, and detailed pre-drawn blueprints to create increasingly intricate formations. Some of these artists have gone on record explaining their process, scouting a field weeks in advance, drawing precise geometric plans on paper, then executing them at night with stakes, string, and a plank dragged by rope to flatten the stalks in controlled sweeps. This is very likely a major part of why complexity climbed so sharply after 1990, not because something otherworldly flipped a switch, but because a secret, amateur craft had just gone semi-public, and its practitioners had every incentive to get more ambitious, more precise, and more impressive with each passing season, especially once crop circles became a global tourist and media attraction, drawing visitors and revenue to towns across Wiltshire every summer. Some of the most famous formations from this later period illustrate just how far the craft advanced. In 1996, a formation appeared near Stonehenge itself depicting what looked like a detailed fractal pattern known as a Julia set, over 100 meters across, containing more than 100 circles of varying sizes. In 2001, a formation at Milk Hill displayed a design resembling a double helix, stretching across an enormous field with hundreds of individual circles arranged with striking precision. These were not shy, tentative works. They were confident, large-scale productions, the kind of thing you would expect from experienced artists working with modern tools, not from an evolving, unknown intelligence. None of this makes the subject any less interesting. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. Somewhere in rural England, a joke between two friends in 1978 grew into a global subculture of secretive nighttime artists, working with nothing but rope, boards, and darkness, producing some of the most visually striking large-scale geometric art on the planet, briefly convincing millions of people that something otherworldly had touched down in a wheat field. The mystery isn't gone, it has simply moved. It's no longer who or what is doing this, but how did an anonymous, undocumented folk art movement become skilled enough to fool scientists, tourists, and television crews for decades, using tools any of us could buy at a hardware store? Still, not every formation has a tidy explanation, and this is where honest researchers tend to get more careful rather than more dismissive. A research group called the BLT Research Team, led by biophysicist William Levengood, examined plant samples from a number of formations and reported unusual features. Crop stalks bent sharply at the nodes rather than snapped, in a way they argued was difficult to replicate with a simple mechanical plank, occasional anomalies in soil samples, and elevated levels of certain minerals in some cases. These findings are genuinely disputed. Skeptical investigators, including members of scientific skepticism organizations, have pointed out that human teams with practice, planning, and simple tools have repeatedly demonstrated they can produce node bending and other supposedly anomalous effects using nothing more exotic than a plank, a rope, and careful footwork, and that some of Levengood's specific claims were never independently replicated by other labs. The honest scientific position sits between the two extremes. Most crop circles, especially post-1990, have well-documented human origins, while a smaller number of older or more remote cases remain genuinely unresolved, largely due to a lack of physical evidence, contamination of sites by tourists before scientists arrived, or simply insufficient investigation at the time. So where does that leave modern image analysis? And what did feeding thousands of these formations into a pattern recognition system actually reveal? Rather than decoding a message, what emerges is something more grounded but still fascinating, a visual timeline of a craft evolving. When formations are sorted by year and measured for structural complexity, the number of distinct elements, the degree of symmetry, the presence of nested or repeating shapes, you can watch, decade by decade, a hobby transform into an art form. The 1970s formations cluster near the bottom of any complexity scale, as simple as a single-struck match. The 1980s show clusters gaining companions, symmetry appearing for the first time, small compositions forming. By the 1990s and 2000s, after the technique went public and competitive collectives got involved, complexity accelerates sharply and then plateaus at a very high level, populated by works that are less mysterious markings and more large-scale outdoor sculpture, made by human artists who take enormous pride in their craft and often document their own process in detail. That trajectory, simple, then clustered, then suddenly and dramatically more elaborate right around the early 1990s, lines up almost perfectly with the public timeline of human circle-making techniques becoming widely known and competitively practiced. It's a satisfying, if less cosmic, explanation. The shapes got more complex because the people making them got better at it, shared their methods, and had an audience that rewarded ambition. No hidden intelligence required, no extraterrestrial curriculum, just human creativity responding to human incentives, the same way any art form escalates once its techniques become common knowledge and its practitioners start competing for attention and recognition. The unresolved cases deserve honesty too, rather than either dismissal or exaggeration. A handful of formations, usually older, isolated, or discovered before investigators arrived, still carry genuine, unexplained physical anomalies that haven't been definitively reproduced by known human methods. Serious researchers continue to study them, and it would be inaccurate to claim every single crop circle in 50 years of records has a confirmed human origin. What's also inaccurate, though, is claiming that a modern AI has uncovered evidence of a non-human intelligence practicing and refining a secret language in the wheat. No credible, published research supports that specific claim, and treating pattern recognition output as proof of intent, as opposed to a description of how a human craft evolved over time, is exactly the kind of leap that turns a fascinating, well-documented cultural phenomenon into something it was never shown to be. So here's where that leaves us, and where it leaves you standing at the edge of one of these fields, looking at a shape too clean to feel like an accident. The geometry is real. The escalation in complexity is real and well documented. The confession from the original creators is real and on the record. The remaining unexplained cases are real too, though rare and hard to verify after the fact. What isn't established is any evidence of a non-human author, an accelerating alien curriculum, or a message counting down to some future date. The far stranger, far more human truth is this. For 50 years, in the dark, in total secrecy, ordinary people have been quietly building some of the most impressive geometric art the world has ever produced, using nothing but string, wood, and a very good reason to keep their identities hidden. If a truly unexplained formation ever does appear, one with no plank marks, no rope stakes, no known group claiming it, would you trust the mystery, or would you assume, correctly 9 times out of 10, that somewhere out there, someone is just very, very good at their craft?